I'm really delighted to be with you this afternoon to celebrate the Harrison wing and the Harrison family. Thank you very much. I want to explore with you this question. 100 years ago, these spaces were new, and they looked modern. What did that mean at the time? To answer that, I'll discuss 4 modern ideas that I think this building embodies. In speaking this afternoon, I'm going to be depending heavily on the historical research of the team that wrote this building's Historic Structures report in 2005. Sean Evans, Jeffrey Cohen, and Ann Blair Brownlee, who has a similar name. The first modern idea that is evident, I should have shown you that slide than what I was just saying. The first modern idea that is evident here is the notion that humans ought to be able to plan for the future. Modern people imagine that they are masters of their own fates, and even if we can't predict exactly what is to come, we don't like to have to wait passively for it to arrive. Making architecture at Penn had already shown this modern propensity for looking ahead when we began to plan this museum. The Frank Furness-designed University Library, completed just a year before planning began on the museum, was designed with an expandable book stack whose south wall could be moved southward to accommodate a conceptually infinitely growing book collection. Only one addition was actually built, however, before that plan was abandoned. Otherwise, we might have to walk to Wilmington to get a book. The new library was also designed to accommodate the then brand new University Museum. But for it, no provision was made for expansion. And the small rooms around the great reading room that were allocated to the museum, like the one on the right, were immediately filled, and the burgeoning collection spilled out into the stair hall and into the horseshoe-shaped room on the second floor that had been intended to serve as an auditorium. The nascent Penn Museum wasn't alone in this miscalculation of its future needs. Even a museum that did plan for expansion, like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, founded in 1870, could fail to plan for enough growth. The MFA expanded, as planned, in 3 phases on its original site on Copley Square, as shown here. But having filled the site, it had to move to the Fenway in 1909. The Metropolitan Museum in New York made an even worse job of it. Although it seemingly had all of Central Park into which to expand from its 1870s core that you see at the middle, it managed to wear out 4 gifted architectural teams in making master plans that were successively abandoned. The collections were accommodated ultimately, of course, but the chaotic tangle that is the plan of that museum today was created in the process. Planning for a standalone museum for Penn's collections proceeded much more rationally. A very large site adjacent to the still raw-looking West Philadelphia campus, the site is at the bottom, the campus in 1891 is on the top. A large site was obtained from the city almost as soon as the new library, which is where the museum was first housed, had opened. Provost William Pepper and the museum's effective director, managing committee member Sarah York Stevenson, put their heads together at that time, and the provost, Pepper, sketched a museum whose wings could be built successively, the first one in dark pink here, a primitive little diagram that he jokingly told Mrs. Stevenson was quite worthy of Michelangelo. Pepper quickly turned things over to the professionals, but rather nonsensically, I'd have to say, he appointed 4 members of the young staff of Penn's new architecture school to flesh out his concept. That's the group at the left. Walter Cope and John Stewartson, Frank Miles Day, who was a lot younger when he was designing the building than he was when the photograph was taken, and Wilson Eyre. When Charles Harrison, at right, became provost in 1894, work accelerated on planning the museum. And although the unwieldy partnership of architects did not fall apart, it does make it difficult to tell who did what. What is clear is that right from the start, it was imagined that the museum would be built piece by piece, wing by wing, and even as the question of what style to build it in, here ancient Roman is suggested, it was the principle of rational planning was kept firmly in place. As I'll say more about in a minute, Italian Romanesque was ultimately chosen as the style to put on top of that great planning exercise, on top of the master plan that was formalized in 1895 to 96, the diagram that you see at the bottom. That diagram was a prodigious vision with 5 courts of honor and 3 great domes, all interconnected by a network of slender galleries like the fibers of an architectural spider's web. All of which was a vast enlargement in the scale of Pepper's original little scheme that you see there on the bottom right. It seemed to allow for infinite expansion. As expected, only a few filaments of this web were spun by the architectural arachnids in the first phase, namely the galleries that surround what is now the Warden Garden, completed in 1899. But with an unusually confident eye toward the future and a steadfast commitment to the master plan, the first phase construction drawings also included the first of the intended rotundas. There were supposed to be 3 ultimately, you recall, for which the foundations were actually built as the courtyard was being constructed. In 1912, when the university had at last gathered the resources to proceed with the rotunda, Wilson Eyre freshened up the design for it, and the foundations, in fact, had to be replaced at that time, as we'll say more about in a couple of moments. But the undergoing logic of the expansion plan remained in place and was realized in the spaces that we celebrate today. And this wasn't a one-off affair. Until the Depression halted construction at the University Museum in 1929, the museum continued to grow more or less in accord with the design of 1895. There's something almost imperiously rational, one might say modern, about that. Another modern feature of the museum is its embrace of new technology. Steel beams made the long spans of its first galleries possible, but I want to focus on another innovative technology, the almost magical vault building system of the rotunda, which makes possible the 90-foot dome above us and the 90-foot dome above that. We see the rotunda here under construction in 1915 in these 2 views. As the advertisement on the right reveals, the magic came from the structural system that was developed and patented by Barcelona emigre Rafael Guastavino, whose son, also named Rafael, had inherited the business by the time our domes were built. The system, illustrated here with photographs of other buildings built by the Guastavinos, was based on a Catalonian vernacular structural system. It consisted of hard terracotta tiles, only 1 inch thick, held together with an unusually tenacious mortar to create what Guastavino called cohesive construction. It did not require the perfect fitting together of building blocks, as in a traditional stone vault, or the enormous thickness of a concrete system, and it could be built without temporary supportive framing, without centering. While the Guastavino system was inspired by medieval technology, its perfection, its marketing, and its industrialization were quintessentially modern. We need to look inside what's above us in order to understand how the magic works. In the space between the rotunda's dome, that's the dome above us, and between that dome and the roof, the area pointed to by the yellow arrow in the section diagram at the lower left, in that area you can see the top of the only 3-inch thick vault of that dome, which is made up of just 3 layers of the tiles like the one I held up. And you can also make out the little struts with which that very thin vault supports the very heavy tile roof on top of it. Oh, and you can see my wife too. Directly over our heads is something even more fantastic. We are sitting under an exceptionally shallow dome. 90 feet across and only 7 feet high. If it were not literally glued together by the Guastavino system, it would be impossibly weak. And here is the really amazing thing. It's not only strong enough to support itself, this dome also supports the floor of the rotunda above us. I've always thought that the audience in this old photograph looks a little uneasy. Perhaps because they've just heard about how the Guastavino system works. The architectural vocabulary created by the young designers of the University Museum, that vocabulary was eclectic, and their uninhibited embrace of all manner of diverse forms, which were chosen almost entirely for their aesthetic rather than for their symbolic value, that was another modern manifestation. As I've said, the foundational style of the museum is the Lombard Romanesque, the round-arched brick architecture of the 11th and the 12th centuries in northern Italy. But this was not fetishized. The architects had previously considered a wide range of other alternatives, and which they found attractive, and when they settled on the Romanesque, they treated it freely and mixed it with other things. To start with, it seemed like they flipped through a kind of Rolodex of possible styles. As you've perhaps noticed, the first surviving design, which you see again at the top, perhaps by Frank Miles Day, is rather sternly Roman, classical in form. Very much like a bevy of influential museum designs that were created at the same time in the early 1890s, including McKim, Mead & White's Brooklyn Museum at the bottom, and the winning design in a premature competition that was designed to build a new Philadelphia Museum of Art that you see in the middle. But that grandiose antique vision for this building was quite swiftly put aside for something almost casual. The pair of designs that you see here, apparently created by Cope and Stewardson, have white plastered walls and shallow pitched red tile roofs, all of which alluding unmistakably to Spanish colonial models. That stylistic path, too, had recently been trodden by the designers of the new resort architecture of Florida. This is one of the two hotels in St. Augustine designed by Carrere and Hastings, the architects of the New York Public Library. The Philadelphians didn't copy the alligator, but this rather exotic style did find favor here, as seen in the Overbrook School for the Blind by Cope and Stewardson. However, that style was not chosen for the museum, and as I said, in the end, the style that was chosen was Italian Romanesque. The evidence of the drawings suggests that it was Wilson Eyre who led in this decision-making. The style was cheaper to build than Roman, but more high style than Spanish colonial. The simple brick massing, the distinctive domes, and the many forms of arcading that one finds in the big churches of Milan were quite faithfully quoted and freely rearranged in the drawings for this building from 1895 to 96. And parenthetically, Eyre's role as the leader among the collaborators in establishing this direction of design is confirmed by the fact that a few years later, he created an Italian Romanesque design for the Farren Hospital in Massachusetts that you see here. As I suggested, maintaining the purity of this foundational style was of no interest to the designers. They ransacked their sketchbooks for visually beguiling enrichments, and in that process hit upon the distinctive marble-hooded doorway at the Church of Sant'Alessandro in Lucca, a church that used that doorway which you see at the lower right, which was recorded both by Eyre in a magazine clipping at the top left in his notebook, and by Day, who sketched it in the sketchbook page that you see at the bottom middle. The Lucca door is an anomaly in Romanesque architecture, looking much more like a belatedly Roman form or a precociously Renaissance one. But it became the keynote of the first phase of the University Museum, the main door in the first courtyard, as you see in Wilson Eyre's sketch at the top right. Also made of marble were the plaques, largely in a discordant classical style, that were commissioned from the sculptor John Ross and added to the eclectic mix of the first phase of the building. Most alien of all was the gateway, whose open wooden framing betrays its source in Chinese and Japanese architecture. It can be connected quite specifically to the gate that you see at top left, at one of the Tokugawa shrines in Nikko, Japan, which is depicted in a magazine clipping in Wilson Ayer's collection at the bottom left. Of course, its Japanese pedigree is almost never recognized by visitors to the museum because it and all of these borrowings are tied together in a single cosmopolitan force with such great visual logic. Helping to pull it all together is the overall emphasis on hand craftsmanship that one sees throughout this building, in the intentionally rough-looking mortar joints at the lower left, and the varied color of the brickwork, in the virtuosic ironwork of the gates and lamps at the lower right, and in the stone mosaics in the walls across the top, and in the Tiffany glass mosaics in the cove cornice. This exuberant display of arts and crafts movement ideals was itself a species of modernism. Now, eclecticism was itself something that all of the contributing architects practiced in their own independent work. Ayer had built medieval and Northern Renaissance-inspired houses right next to each other on Locust Street. Cope and Stewardson had borrowed from 4 centuries of English architecture to bring variety to their buildings at Penn. And Day had comfortably designed a Renaissance-inspired palazzo for the horticultural hall on Broad Street while looking for inspiration in 17th century Holland for a pair of houses on 17th Street. But what distinguished their work at the University Museum was the synthesis of so much diverse material in a single building. I've already indicated some of this, but the most potent juxtaposition of dissimilar sources is the contrast between the inside and the outside. Passing from the dark brick, predominantly medieval courtyard that you see at the top, one enters through the door that is in the center at the bottom into a world of plaster and marble classicism. While perspective of the Romanesque exterior hung proudly on the wall inside the door, probably to inspire donors to pay for another piece of the master plan, the interior detailing seems to have been retained from the first conception of the buildings, of what the buildings outside would look like a Roman monument. And indeed, in its first decades of use, the entrance hall was full of classical art. There were plaster casts of ancient sculpture. The Parthenon frieze runs across the top of these 2 black and white photographs here, and the Arch of Trajan at Benevento, a cast of it, fills most of the wall that one would have seen after coming into what was called Pepper Hall. There you also would have encountered some of the myriad copies of Roman bronzes that John Wanamaker gave to the museum in 1904. But most Roman of all, and most jarringly unlike, at least to our eyes, the Romanesque exterior, would have been the Rotunda as originally planned. The visitor's route in red would have taken her through the Benevento Arch and into a domed hall that you see in yellow that was modeled explicitly on the most famous domed space of the ancient world, the Pantheon in Rome. The details line up as these compared sections show you. Rome on the left, Philadelphia on the right. The proportions are also exactly the same and perfect. The 2 spaces are exactly as tall as they are wide. And the University Museum dome was to be precisely 1/2 as big as the Roman model, 72 feet across instead of 144 feet. It's hard for me to conjure up exactly how intriguing or perhaps disquieting this inside-outside contrast would have been, but the architects seem to have been more than satisfied with it, steadfastly committed to it, at least until 1912. In 1912, when they at last got the go-ahead to actually build the long-planned rotunda, they also got a directive to add an auditorium to the program, to insert a large auditorium underneath the intended Pantheon. This required them to rethink what would hold up the floor of that great space, The intended supporting piers would make such an auditorium impossible. And that pushed them to adopt the Guastavino system, and that in turn allowed them to increase the diameter and the height of the upper space to 90 feet. The new design, with the inserted auditorium in yellow, is shown here on the left. All of these changes pushed the architects, probably led by Ayer, in the end to also reevaluate the now nearly decade-long decision to build a Roman interior. And the result of that reconsideration is the austere brick hall that we now know on the left, which does not look like the Pantheon in Rome. The ceiling offering and the classical details of the Pantheon have disappeared in favor of a simple geometrical vocabulary of arches, wall planes, and dome. This, it must be said, is generally speaking in the same language as the Romanesque exterior, or at least in a kind of elemental, simplified, related dialect. The ceiling offering, as you of course can see above you, has moved down to the auditorium, which is also somewhat more highly decorated than the upper hall. Most notable here is the glazed tile ornament, including what you see surrounding the proscenium here, all of it made by the famous Rookwood Pottery Works of Cincinnati, one of the preeminent arts and crafts manufacturers at the time, and thus tying the interior of this space, more than any other interior in the building, to the ethos and the aesthetics of that first exterior courtyard. But it isn't with the modernism of this building's eclecticism that I want to leave you. I want to highlight one further modern trait that is related to that eclecticism, but untethered from that eclecticism, moves our building into the center of the development of modern art in the 20th century. And that is its association with a modern way of looking. It is, I think, enormously significant that the photographer hired by the museum to make the iconic first pictures of the new wing in 1915 was Charles Sheeler, the Philadelphia-born and Philadelphia-trained painter and self-taught photographer. Sheeler made unflinching, straight-ahead photographs of the building's spaces, minimizing the already modest richness of this space, while emphasizing the austere, undecorated geometries of the Rotunda. Mind you, Wilson Ayer, in radically simplifying his architecture, had silently invited Sheeler to depict it this way, the one artist, in a sense, amplifying the work of the other. This was the same discipline of vision that Sheeler would bring to his paintings when he returned to that medium in the 1920s and 1930s and helped to develop, in depictions of machinery and of the industrial landscape, a branch of the modern movement called precisionism. This wondrous example of his abstractly disciplined realism, a painting of the driving wheels of a modern steam locomotive, is in the American Still Life show that's now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. What I want to suggest to you is that Ayer, in his simplified final design for the Rotunda, prepared a kind of gymnasium for the ocular exercises of the new, more pressing sort of 20th century modernism, like that of Sheeler. And that Wilson Ayer's work, in its reliance on pure form, demands to be seen in the company of other modern works of 1915, such as these by Picasso, Malevich, Mondrian, and Kandinsky. You're right to be a little skeptical about such a claim, made about a Romanesque revival building, but let me bolster my argument by concluding with some discussion of the way that another Romanesque revival building of about the same era, the Shelton Hotel in New York, was discussed and lauded by modernist critics. I think that they can stand in for what such critics would have said about this building in 1915 if much more had been written about it, if it had attracted more attention. And they help to explain what Sheeler was trying to accomplish with his photographs. The Shelton Hotel caught the attention of critics, and it attracted the attention of many of them, first of all, because at 34 stories tall, it was the tallest hotel in the world when it opened in 1924, just 9 years after this building. It was a steel frame building, but the architect, Arthur Loomis Harmon, had wrapped it in Romanesque detail, which was quite lush at the main entrance, although the upper parts of the tower were more severe in the mode of the University Museum's 1950 edition. And it was that simplicity that caught the attention of the architectural artists and critics. Rockwell Kent, the great illustrator, and Hugh Ferris, the foremost architectural renderer of the 20th century, both depicted the Shelton as an elemental composition of forms. In 1923, Hugh Ferris put this in words, praising the Shelton's vast bulk, its arresting silhouette, its cumulative piling up of mass upon mass, and the vitality which its upward strides exhibit, undisguised by any attempt to superimpose subdivision or ornamentation. This assessment was echoed by many other critics, and the modernist celebrity of the Shelton was only increased when Alfred Stieglitz and Georgia O'Keeffe moved in, taking an apartment on the 30th floor. O'Keeffe painted the building as a simple brick mass on the right, and Stieglitz used his apartment as a vantage from which to take some of his best-known urban photographs, including the shot that you see on the left of the torso of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, with all the ornamental top and bottom cut off. The building's celebrity was durable, attracting later attention. This is Berenice Abbott's 1939 photograph of the even simpler rear facade. And Harmon's success with the Shelton led to further commissions, including a miniature version of that Romanesque New York hotel on 20th Street here in Philadelphia, now an apartment house for those with small means run by Sister Mary Scullion, with a convenient capogiro on the ground floor. And in Philadelphia, the Shelton also attracted the attention of Fisk Kimball, who came here in 1925 to take over the leadership of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Kimball was a modern formalist, although somewhat less celebrated and much less cranky than Philadelphia's most notorious formalist, Albert Barnes. And it was as a formalist that Kimball wrote admiringly of the Shelton. The essential thing in it is that balance, that geometrical simplicity, bounded by unbroken lines of the simplest geometrical form. And perhaps because Kimball saw a broader congruence between the elementarily simple shapes of Romanesque and Romanesque revival architecture and the modernist experimentation with form, Kimball acquired for his new museum a real Romanesque church portal and a real Romanesque cloister, which he installed in dominating positions in the south wing of the new museum. Fisk Kimball would, of course, have known the University Museum's Rotunda, and he thus gave his own building a Romanesque interior of its own. It is likely that he looked at this building, and looked at everything else for that matter, in a modern formalist way. He saw it, in other words, the way Charles Sheeler photographed it. Putting all this together, I think it is safe to say that the Harrison wing was created in the spirit of its age, and seen and appreciated in the same spirit. It was modern in more ways than one. And what became of Arthur Loomis Harmon, the architect of that other Romanesque building, the one in New York that attracted so much attention? In 1929, Harmon joined the firm of R.H. Shreve and William Lamb, and together with them, next year, he designed the tallest building in the world. The Empire State Building is, of course, a lot taller than the Harrison Auditorium, but both of them look modern if you look at them in a modern way. Thanks. And next, Alex Pizzato.
Thank you. Hello, welcome. We're here here to celebrate 100 years of the Harrison. Oh, sorry. We're here to celebrate 100 years of the Harrison Rotunda. And I will be talking about some achievements and some of the people who were involved. The museum began in 1887. William Pepper was provost at the university at the time. He is little known today, but he actually was incredibly famous when he died. He was considered the second Benjamin Franklin. In any case, he founded the Free Library of Philadelphia. He also expanded the university greatly. And his last and most precious enterprise was the University Museum, the Penn Museum. And the museums began instantly sending out expeditions around the world, collecting artifacts, excavations, and it occupied first a room in the third floor of College Hall, but that was instantly filled up, and then they moved to the newly built library that David spoke about, the Furnace Library. This is the American section wing. At the behest of Sarah York Stevenson, his right-hand woman, they realized that a building of its own was needed. So in 1894, William Pepper stepped down as provost and dedicated the rest of his career to the museum, to building a building. This is the site. We're looking towards the South Street Bridge. Franklin Field is now on the left, and the museum is on the right. But the idea for the site was really grand. He assembled a team of architects, as David mentioned already, to create this enormous structure, yet elegant and extremely original, with courtyards in the front and the back. And the architect in charge was Wilson Eyre, although there were three firms, Cope and Stewartson and Frank Miles Day and brother as well. Unfortunately, Pepper got sick, and the rotunda was supposed to have been built in 1898 as part of the first wing, but in 1898 Pepper died, and so the rotunda was scrapped. The foundations were laid, but they didn't finish the building because Pepper had not finished the fundraising. The architects were in fact very upset about this. They felt that the building looked deficient as constructed without the dome behind it. The building obviously filled up instantly, and it took a while after Pepper for reorganization to take place and to begin a new campaign. And it was Charles Custis Harrison, who he had been Pepper's protege, and he succeeded Pepper as provost of the university in 1894, and he stayed on as provost until 1911, at which point, just like Pepper, he stepped down to run this museum. The museum was the pride and joy of both of these men. And Harrison, together with George Byron Gordon, who came here as curator in 1903, but by 1910 had proven his worth and became Harrison's right-hand man at the museum, the first scientific and full-time director of the institution, who was known to have a really strong personality, as strong as the tips of his mustache, they say. Gordon was fanatical about the museum. He also was a true connoisseur. He began his career in my archaeology, but then did Eskimo, then also eventually Chinese and other. He wrote a book on London, on the British flag, all kinds of things. He dabbled in many things. And Harrison and Gordon, together with Eckley Brinton Cox Jr., who was heir to the Cox mining wealth from, here from central and western, central Pennsylvania. Cox was passionate about ancient Egypt. He loved this museum, and he was an amazing donor. Together, Gordon, Harrison, and Cox brought the museum to its incredible international reputation that it still has today. Cox was so generous that Harrison and Gordon had to stop asking him for money. They went to his mother instead and made sure it was okay. Cox would pay for salaries, operating expenses, publications. There he is seated with his family visiting excavations in Nubia in 1908, which he funded. So in 1910, the museum, well, in 1911, as Harrison stepped down as provost to run the museum, the first thing was new extensions to the building. They had actually planned to build both this rotunda and the Egyptian wing at the same time, but the commercial museum that was behind us, and then which later turned into the Civic Center Museum and now is gone, filed a suit because they had a path that was theirs, they thought, and that's where the Egyptian wing was going to go, and that portion had to be delayed for a number of years. The suit wasn't resolved until 1916, by then it was World War I. In any case, so the rotunda went along on its own. The same architects were reconvened, slightly different names, but Wilson Air was still in charge. One of the things that happened at the museum with the reorganization is all the former curators chafed under Gordon and soon left. This included Herman Hilprecht, famous excavator at Nippur, Babylonian, cuneiform expert at the museum. Also seated there, David Randall McIver was our Egyptologist. He also left. Frank Speck back here, he and Gordon had legendary fights, and he also left, although he then went on to found the anthropology department at Penn, so he stayed at Penn, but not at the museum. They all left, but Gordon soon hired many other individuals. The museum was, around the time this building was being planned, was all over the world. This is Clarence Fisher at Dendera. He was also excavating at Memphis. He apparently not worried about World War I. This is 1914, 1915. And these are in fact the columns that you see in the lower Egyptian gallery that he discovered, the ruins of the throne room of the Palace of Merneptah. Edith Aldoan, a curator of our Mediterranean section, was digging in Crete. That's in 1914 and 1915. We also had an expedition in Siberia. Henry Usher Hall, curator of general ethnology. There you see him with Marie Ciepliczka, Polish ethnologist. The museum's been all over the world in unique places. Lots of reindeer up here, of course. At the time, Carl Bishop was in China trying to set up an excavation for the museum. He went in 1915 and 1916, again in 1917. Unfortunately, the political conditions were such that he never set up a real project, and he came back empty-handed. Speck, as I mentioned, though he'd been fired by Gordon, he was actually doing research all along the northeast United States, amongst many, many different groups. This is Penobscot with snowshoes, Maine, 1911. There's Speck again. You can see his insouciant demeanor. Gordon did not like that. That was just the wrong attitude. Gordon brought Louis Shotridge to Philadelphia. He was a Tlingit, full-blooded Indian from Alaska, southeastern Alaska. He and his wife came here in 1912, and they also gave tours to school children. They dressed up as the real Indian, the Plains Indian, to do that. Shotridge also learned some anthropology and then traveled back to Alaska for many years, on and off, to collect in all those areas. So these are photos from Louis Shotridge. He eventually fell afoul of some of his people for bringing objects back to the East Coast. But today people are recognizing the record that he kept, and all the work that he did was incredibly valuable to everyone. Robert Burkett, an old classmate of Gordon's at Harvard, was living in Guatemala, and Gordon asked him to excavate in the highlands, and here are some of the excavations and very nice views from Guatemala about 1914, 1915. And Burkett spent his spare time collecting linguistic notes amongst all the groups in that area. And one of our principal expeditions at the time was the Amazon expedition. William Curtis Farabee, he's little remembered today, but he spent 3 years in the Amazon, 1913 to 1916, safe in Amazon wilds, etc., etc. He went to British Guiana, Brazil, Peru. He also later excavated in Peru. He's remembered for, he was tapped by President Woodrow Wilson in 1919 to draw up the cultural maps of the world at the Treaty of Versailles. He also, there he is on riding water buffalo in Brazil, 1914. And he also met Theodore Roosevelt while on the expedition. They met up in Trinidad, I believe, there's a letter in our files from Theodore Roosevelt written to Charles Custis Harrison about how the immense impression that Farabee made on him. And in the meantime, also, the museum continued to collect other materials that came in. This is a photo of the George High American Indian collection that later became the Museum of the American Indian. And Alexander Scott, who was an English painter working in India and Tibet, he sent us many collections right around this time. And of course, the museum was doing its educational mission as well. Here are schoolgirls in the galleries. As David explained, the Guastavino company came in to resolve the issue. We needed a new auditorium, and they had the right techniques, and so it's good I don't have to explain architectural terms. David already did that. In any case, here's an advertisement for the company using the Rotunda, almost built as the promotional picture. Here we have a news clipping showing it also almost done. And they thought the wing would open January 1st, 1915. In fact, it didn't. We have a number of panicky letters from Gordon to the architects complaining about everything, things that are not meeting specifications, such as hinges and fixtures, etc. The trash left by the employees, the ladders. In any case, but when it was built, this was the tallest building on campus in 1915. This is the exhibit, would be right above us where the museum shop is right now. This is when it opened. The auditorium opened on December 4th, 1915 with a lecture by James Barnes, The Wildlife of Africa, with motion picture films. This is very state-of-the-art at the time. Here's school children at a lecture. people get confused. They hear this is the largest unsupported dome, something or other in the world. Well, there is a weird Guinness Book of World Records record, but it's not the top of the. It's not that this is either one of these is the largest dome in the world, but this dome that's also supporting a floor is the largest unsupported masonry dome floor in the world. It's hard to say that though. So this is a letter from Guastavino explaining just that. And all the other larger domes, which are well known to architects, are roof domes, carrying practically no loads except themselves. And this also has this, well, pretty large light fixture as well, and stuff upstairs, which is bearing down. Also, when it was built, it had a modern system for air purification and air circulation. All these grills, there was fresh air was pumped in and pumped out. It's all explained again right here, long explanation. In any case, it was state-of-the-art at the time, and we're still using it, but so it's not quite as state-of-the-art anymore. But another concern for Gordon was, well, what are we going to put what are we going to display in the exhibit? The original domes, the 3 domes of the original plan, were supposed to house the cultures of Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, and the classical world. They were the preeminent ancient civilizations. But as time progressed, so one of the newspapers claimed that the Sphinx was going to move in there. The Sphinx was brought here in 1913. There's in fact a book that just came out on the history of the Museum Sphinx, which celebrated 100 years here just 2 years ago. And it was placed out in the upper courtyard where the weathering was worrisome to everyone. And they wanted to bring it back inside, so as the Rotunda was being built, that was possibly a consideration, but of course, that's impossible. It's too heavy for just about any floor. Gordon was also contacting dealers for different types of collections. He was getting into Persian art. He wasn't really sure what he was going to display. As it turns out, though, one of the dealers he was in touch with, the Devine Brothers of London, they were trying to sell the J. Pierpont Morgan Chinese art collection, mostly porcelains, and after some brainstorming, they decided that they would do a loan collection to the Museum of Chinese Art. And it spread, and other dealers all joined in as well, and the museum even bought a number of the pieces on the spot, but there was about $1 million worth of collections in this Oriental art exhibition, and Gordon had to prohibit drinks in the gallery for the occasion because most of the material was in fact on loan, unfortunately the opening for the gallery was February 16th, 1916, and there was a storm. They sent out 8,000 invitations, but the winter weather did not cooperate, and not too many people showed up. They had a second advance opening 2 weeks later, which was better attended. In any case, ever afterwards, this became the Chinese wing, the Chinese gallery. And there's more pictures taken by Charles Sheeler, as David mentioned. And I'm wondering if I'm forgetting anything here. No, I don't think so. In any case, what was supposed to be only the Western Dome has become the crowning achievement of this building. The main monument, here it's shown with the former Pepper Garden on the side. And here's a picture, an illustration by the famous American illustrator Thornton Oakley, who visited the museum in the 30s. And so that you understand how impressive the place is, even seasoned travelers are impressed when they visit. This is Margaret Thatcher in 1993. And you know she's seen a lot of palaces and a lot of nice buildings, and yet she too was taken in by the architecture. And that's the end of my lecture. This is Charles Custis Harrison.